Okay, so far what I've found is that if I don't have this global thing, I can't change a variable. And that's because it's declaring a local version of x. So it's saying, look, in the function change x, there is an x variable. That x variable that's part of the change x function is not the same x as the one that's global. But if I use the global keyword, then I can change it. You guys see that? The return statement there is not actually doing anything in this case. You guys see that?
Yep.
An alternate way to do this, another way you can do this is you can say, all right, I'm going to make a different function that I'm going to call changex. And I guess I should call it the alternate changex. So another way to change x would be to say, all right, and I guess I should make a different variable.
What would the return function have been doing there?
Yeah, so let me show you. Let's see. So I'm going to make this, I'm going to call this thing change y just to be consistent in naming convention. Right, so I have x is 100 and y, or x is 10 and y is 100, and I'm trying to write a change y function. And I'm just going to do this in a way that I think would work. So I'm going to say, all right, so I'm going to make y that's going to be equal to 2022, actually. Maybe I'll use 3's just to make it obvious that it's different. And then I'll return that y, that value y. Okay. And then I'm going to say here, I'm going to say let y equal change y. And then I need to print y down here. Okay, so the distinction here, right, is that what I'm doing is I'm setting the variable y to 100 at the top, and then I'm defining a function that changes y, and the way it changes y is it makes a new different variable y that's equal to 333. So that's a declare and initialize. And then it's returning it. And then what I'm doing it down here is I'm using really an overwrite, an assign statement, right? So I'm saying y is now the result from the change y function. That makes sense? And the result of the...
I guess I just don't understand, like, what's the logic behind when you say it's returning the y?
Mm-hmm. So that's exactly like in the mathematical sense, that's the output of the function.
Okay, that makes sense.
So when I do change y with parentheses after it, the result of that, right, the thing that becomes to the computer is whatever you're returning. And so in my case, I'm returning this value 333 because that's what's stored in the variable y. Now, the weird thing is, calling this thing y doesn't change the behavior at all. It's the same function. In fact, calling that function change y is actually a really dumb name because that function doesn't change y. That function really should be called return 333 because that's what that function does. And P.S., that's a dumb name too. Why is return 333 a crummy name for a function? Anybody?
It's essentially a variable.
Yeah, yeah. This is sort of a dumb function anyway, and two, I would stay away from using reserved words in your names. That may, and also returning or putting numbers in your function names is also not great. They really should be kind of a description of what you intend to do with this thing. As a readability thing, return 333 is probably actually a good function name for readability, but it's kind of a crummy name for like searching through your code. Does that kind of make sense?
All right.
Okay, so let's try a slightly different thing. Let's see if this works inside an object. So I'm going to make a new variable that I'm going to call z. Oh, maybe let me make one more little statement. This second approach is this is kind of unpreferred. Reason being, if you want to actually reset a bunch of global, like you want to change a bunch of global variables, doing this style of thing is not very convenient. You can do kind of a comma spliced assignment, but it's not great. Like if I wanted to make a new function that does that zeroes out x and y, I'd probably do that as global x, global y, x equals 0, y equals 0. And then I think if I call that thing, so if I do call the zero out x and y function, I should see that they're both 0. That's one method. The other way to do this would be to return an array with 0 and 0 in it, and then kind of comma assign things, but that's not a great way to do things. Does that kind of make sense? Okay. Hearing no complaints, I'll assume that kind of makes sense. Who keeps popping in and out of the voice channel? Hey, Jeremy. Okay, so let's see if we can get this to work in an object. So in an object, I need to make a class. So that's just going to be, I don't know. I'm gonna call it test object, just because I can. And then how do you make an object? What do you need in here? You guys remember?
The self dot stuff, right?
Yeah, I'm gonna need a bunch of self dot stuff. So let's see. I think the first thing I need is an initializer, right? How do you define those? You guys remember?
Def double underscore init double underscore.
Like that?
Yeah.
Okay, and I'm going to give this thing, it needs at the very least self as an argument, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then I'm just going to give this thing a property like self.name equals Steve. Right, and that's really just to give me some kind of feedback that it's even working at all. You guys good with that? Okay, and then I want to make another function that does some of this changing x stuff, right? So I'm gonna do, we'll make another function called change x, and that one's gonna need a self. And then all I'm going to do in there is I'm going to try to set x equal to 1 with lots of zeros. Okay, and then it's again saying this thing about the local variable x is assigned but not used. What is that about? Oh, you guys can't see this stream? Crap. I'm recording this if that helps at all. Otherwise you can go to the link and at least you'll be able to see what I'm working on every time I run it. So I'll just keep running it more often. Okay, so I'm wondering, why is this thing in the definition of change x that's part of the test object class? Why is that saying that it's a local variable that's not used? Anybody?
You didn't specify that you're using the global x.
Yeah, exactly. That's the local x. So that one lives inside this method that lives inside this class. So if you wanted to use the regular x, you need to tell it that you mean the global x. And now if I run this, I should expect it to be a... Oh. Why is it not changing?
Until it's a print.
Yeah, I never actually called it's changing, right? So I've got a whole bunch of things that are changing x, right? I've got a change x function that actually makes a global variable and then changes x. And then I've got a zero function that zeroes out x and y. But why is it not doing this? I just told it to do that. Oh, but that stuff's above it, right? So I should cut that crap and put it down here. Now it'll work, right? Why didn't it work? Anybody? What do you guys got for me?
You told it what a test object is, but you never created a test object.
Perfect. I never created a test object, and I also then never ran this changex method in that test object, right? Okay, so let me make a test object. How do you make one? I'm going to call it Steve. How do you actually make an instance of a class? You guys remember?
Character.
Yeah, you just type the class's name. So it's a test object class, right? And then just give it its arguments. This one doesn't take any. So let me just check that worked. So I'm going to ask Steve to print his name. So I need to print Steve.name. You guys see how that's working?
Oh, right.
Because that's going into the Steve object, right? And getting the name property. And then when a test object is made, it's always named Steve regardless.
Mhm.
So I should see this thing putting out Steve. And that would work even if I changed this, the declaration, right, for that object. If I changed its name to Bill, it would still be named Steve because it's in the initializer that it's named Steve, and that's hard-coded.
Mhm.
You guys see that? But my X variable is still 0. Why is my X variable still 0? I made a test object now. Chaz said that would work. Chaz, did you betray me?
You have to call the method now.
Oh, I just made one. I never did the change X thing. Okay, so that makes sense. So how do I get at that?
Steve.change X.
Perfect. Very nice. Okay. Oh, snap. Cool. Does that thought process make sense now? A little bit better, at least? It's still not the most...
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's still not the most intuitive thing that you can't say, like, global X equals 1,000,000 or whatever this number is. 10 million. Right. But what the global X thing is doing is it's saying, all right, man, look, this means go up to the global scope and get that X variable and use that one in here. Like when I say X, I mean the one that's in the global scope, not the one that's local. You guys see that?
Alright.
Like, let's see. So I just removed the Z equals declaration at the very top. So all I have at the top now are X and Y. But then in the return 333 function, I have a variable Z declared, right? You guys see that? So I should be able to print out the variable Z because it exists, right? But it tells me that Z isn't defined. But Z is defined. It's defined in the return 333 function, and I'm calling the return 333 function on line 21. So why is it telling me that Z is not defined?
Because it's locally in return 33 and not a global.
Yeah, it's part of return 333. Once that function's done, that variable doesn't exist anymore. It only exists as long as you're in the return 333 method, or function in this case. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Basically, it's actually kind of a feature. It's a little bit annoying to get used to, but what it lets you do is reuse the same name over and over again without having issues between functions that use the same names. So the other thing that I encountered the other day with one of you guys was something I maybe hadn't mentioned, which is, let's see. So right here, I made Steve was a test object, right? I'm going to make that take a string. So I'm going to change the way this thing works to take a name. And then I'm going to set self.name equals name. So then when I make the test object Steve, I'm going to have to pass along his name. This should have exactly the same functionality that it had before. I still have a test object named Steve. And if I ask it to print its name, I get Steve. You guys good with that? Okay, so let me make another one. Let me make Bill, which is a test object, and I'll pass along his name, Bill. You guys all good with that? Actually, let me just, I'm just going to do this an easier way. I'm going to say that Bill is the same thing as Steve, right? And then I'll just change Bill's name. Oops, not Steve. Bill.name equals Bill. Does this seem like a reasonable step? Like, I want another one of these. I'll just copy the one I already had and then change the name. That'll be easier.
Right.
You guys kind of good with that? Okay, now this is going to be a little funky. Okay, so hang on. Let me walk myself back through what I just did, because that seems weird. So I made Steve. He was a test object, and I passed along the name Steve. Right? So that named the test object Steve. That named him Steve. And then I said, okay, so Bill is just the same type of thing as Steve, so I'll just copy it in there. And then I'm going to change Bill's name. And then I called the Steve.changeX function, which does this kind of scoping thing. So I don't even, I'm not worried about that right now. But then when I asked Steve to print his name, I got Bill. You guys see that? That's real weird. Maybe it's the way I did that. Maybe if I went back to the other way, it would work. So all I'm doing is I'm saying, all right, look, I'm going to go back to the way where when I make a test object, I just hard code its name to Steve. And then I'm going to make a test object, and then I'm going to say Bill is the same as Steve, and then I'll change Bill's name. That should work. And then maybe I guess I should print out Steve's name, and I should print out Bill's name. And I probably need just a little bit of string formatting here. So I just have a escape character problem. And the only reason I'm doing that is I'm just trying to highlight which one I'm pulling for which line. You guys with me on that? All right, so I'm printing out two lines. There's Steve's name is, and Steve's name, and Bill's name is, and Bill's name. And then the output is saying that they're both the same. They're both named Bill. So why the hell is this doing this? This seems like really badly broken. Let me try this with a string. So I'm going to try it with a string called name. So I'm going to let a string, right? I'm going to let name be a string Steve. And then I'm going to set a new name. Equal to that name thing. And then I'm going to set the new name to Bill. And then I'm going to try to print those out. So I'm going to print out name and new name. Okay, let's see, and I guess I want a line break in here. Okay, so when I did this, right, the variable name was Steve, and then I set the new name variable equal to the regular name variable, and then I set new name to Bill, and then I printed them both out, and they worked the way I would expect them to. Right? Name is Steve, and new name is Bill. But when I did it with... Wait. What was the difference here? You guys see this?
The new name?
I mean, really, all a test object is, right, is it's just an object with one property. The one property is that it has a name. It may as well be a string variable called name, right? Like, it's so damn close. I guess it's got this other function. Maybe it's the other function that's doing something? Okay, so I think I need a way to draw a picture. Can you guys see this whiteboard?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so here's the problem. So in object land and in variable land, things are treated differently. So in object land, I made a thing called Steve, right? And then when I said Steve is Bill, right? I think that what that does is something like this. Steve and Bill are the same, right? So I think that just takes the stuff that's in Steve and copies it into Bill. That's certainly how it works in variables. So in the variable case, I had this name variable, and I copied it into this thing new name. Right? And those were different. So when I changed this one, it didn't do anything. Right? So I changed this one. This one started out as, let's see. So this one started out with me putting Steve into it. Right? So I put Steve into the name, and then I put that into this new name thing, and then I changed it to Bill. And that diagram worked just like this. This happened first, then this happened, then this happened. You guys all with me on the variable side, at least?
Dragon.
Now, on the object side, what I had was Steve, right? And Steve got a name, and that name was Steve. And then when I set Steve, or when I had set Bill equal to Steve, what that should have done is taken all of Steve and copied it into Bill. And the thing is that it doesn't copy. It points at it. So then when you do this name equals Bill thing here, that updates Bill, but then because Bill and Steve are the same thing, that updates Steve too. So this is a thing called passing by value and passing by reference. So in a variable case, it's a value thing. And in an object case, it's a reference thing. And what that means is that when you have two objects, if you say one of these objects equals the other object, all it does is point at the same place in the memory. And so if you change one, the other one changes too. And that's kind of a fundamental difference between objects and variables in here. And that's the way it is in a lot of languages. Most languages don't copy objects. They pass them by reference. So if you do this particularly with lists in Python, lists are objects. They have some methods. So if you say this list equals this other list, then when you change one, you change the other one inadvertently. Does that kind of make sense?
I'm tracking.
Anybody?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so that's the code stuff I had for today. Does anybody have any questions before I turn off the recording here?
How many different naming conventions, or how far would you want to go to have, if one changes, it changes like, say you had 100, and they would all update in the system in their own little fields? Or how far do they go with the list?
Okay.
Objects?
So if you have a pair of lists and you make one of the lists equal to the other one, then they're the same list forever. That goes for anything inside of the lists, because a list is really just a container with stuff in it. If you change things in one of the lists, it'll change things in the other one. Sometimes this is a feature you want, but most of the time it isn't. So there's a list.copy that'll let you copy a list, like it makes a copy, instead of assigning things. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Anybody else? Okay, cool. Last thing, this is really a space-saving measure. This is a thing about saving RAM on the computer, that objects are passed by reference.